Cars that made the 90s, Part 1, Daily Drivers.
90s car culture for me was all about freedom, enthusiasm and excitement. It was all about the joy of driving and driving with your mates in cool cars.
For this episode, we pulled into Caffeine and Machine to chat with Damien, a car collector and YouTuber over at Car Guys TV. But first, a few notes from Sam, who's running an all-original 1990 VW Polo Parade, and Matt, the owner of this 92 MX-5. Guys keeping cars from the era on the road.
Everything likes to rattle. I think that's just a byproduct of the time period really, but that's part of the charm of driving it.
It just feels very in touch with the road. Puts a smile on my face every time I drive it.
The thing is with 90s cars, they're sort of like the last time that cars were really analog. Everything after that, you know, it's got lots of computers. If you open the door on a modern car, for a couple of seconds, it's just going to start beeping at you.
I used to go to a lot of car shows and I saw a lot of different modifications and a lot of things that I liked, and I never really had the money or the drive to do it, and I think now I'm sort of pleased I didn't, because the nostalgia's still there and people appreciate that a lot more. And I mean, I've met the original owner and him seeing the car there and it wasn't in a scrapyard, it was quite a nice feeling to see, you know, the original styling and carpets and everything. It's quite a feat to keep that, I think.
My car journey began in 1990, which is when I finally got my tests. I was loose on the world. I was free to drive anything, to own anything, and to get out there. And I sort of obviously dived straight into motoring with an MG Metro, which I would not recommend. It is not a car that sits well in the annals of history. There's not many rose-tinted views of that car. But I wanted to get out there, and I really started, first of all, I was working my way through in the 90s with fairly humdrum vehicles. Each one, though, felt incredibly special as I moved on. So the MG Metro felt great because it was the first one and it was quite fast for its size. It was rattly, the hydrogas suspension leaked everywhere, so it was constantly on the wonk. But there was a charm about it. You know, I could maintain it myself. I could polish it. I could try and make it my own. I then moved into things like, I remember moving to a Ford Escort 1.4, which felt like a refined rocket ship compared to the MG. And then I started moving into my Astras. So I was in the Vauxhall Astra period. So I had a 3-door and a 5-door. Those cars, again, quite mechanical, fairly primitive, but I appreciated the swoopy design. Everyone in the 90s always wanted the GTE. They came in a beautiful purple. They had a digital dashboard on it. It was racy. It was fast. Not by today's standards. It was as slow as a milk float, I think. But it was the one to have. But of course, being 18, 19 at the time, insurance was sky high. Cars were getting nicked left, right, and centre in the 90s. So it was just a nightmare time for a young person to have a hot car. So you started off with the lower models, and you just appreciated that halo effect of, I've got an Astra, and if you squint, it's a GTE, and everyone knows it isn't, but that's what I thought. So I had sort of Vauxhall Astras, then I moved into a Toyota MR2, classic. This was the Gen 2, so classic 90s car, one of the poster childs of the 90s. That was just otherworldly at the time, fast, reliable, you could rev it, it was just a beautiful thing. It looked really cool as well. It was kind of like the Japanese Ferrari at the time, so I absolutely loved that. It would swap ends on roundabouts like you wouldn't believe. It was a death trap, but I was massively into that. For me, you see, throughout the 90s, I was reading car magazines, and so I, was reading specifically Car by EMAP, which is the one that was my Bible, and then obviously latterly Top Gear when it came out. And so you're just drooling over these road tests. You're looking at the new cars that are coming out. You're looking at the design. You're looking at the stats. You're comparing the stats. So the 90s for me was just this orgy of of stats, cars design and possibility. It was just like there was limitless possibilities of what you could do. You could have any car, you could do whatever you wanted, times were good economically, and just it was just like an absolute halcyon day really. For me, that was the time when car design was at its peak. Everything looked different and interesting, and those cars now, they just do it for me. So I am on a mission at the moment to just go back and acquire as many of those as possible. I've already started, I've got a few, but I just absolutely love cars of that period. They've got such a nostalgic sort of tint to me, and when you get in them, you know they're not peak technology, you know they're a little bit clunky in some ways, but after the 80s, when stuff was interesting, individual, but massively unreliable, the 90s brought reliability and it brought dependability, and then the design really just took off, and Japanese cars in a big way came in, and I mean, I'm all over those cars. I just love it. But point me in the direction of the 90s cars and I am all there, baby. I am there. One thing I find particularly interesting is that, I mean, 90s cars, particularly the everyday cars, you forget they made millions of them. You know, the Ford Escort, the Ford Fiesta were Britain's best-selling cars for like 10, 15 years. There were millions. Ford Granadas, Ford Sierras, all of those sort of general humdrum boxes that people would go to work in are everywhere. Vauxhall Novas, Vauxhall Astras, Vauxhall Belmont, that was the one with a horrible estate sort of boot type thing on it, Vauxhall Carltons. They were cars that were ubiquitous. They were literally everywhere. And when you look back at old footage on, say, YouTube, and you just see a sea of them, these days you don't see so many of them. I mean, whether it's car scrappage schemes, which have absolutely dealt a death blow for a lot of these cars, but one thing I notice is that when you do see one, it really stands out. It's such a wonderful moment to see a pristine car from that era driving past you or alongside you on the motorway, and every single time I'll doff my cap to whoever's driving that. I'll very often physically salute, which they find weird, but I just absolutely love it because everything around it is so dull looking, and then this shining light of a car will just pull in. You'll see something like a 2.9 Ford Granada Scorpio, and it's just like, wow, someone has kept that. They've kept it going when everything was telling them to junk it and move on, when the government was trying to force them to do it, when they were looking at it going, there's a bit of rust there I need to tend to. They still stuck with it. They got those things fixed and they kept it going. And there's just something so heroic, something so, in a way, uniquely British about the fact that people will keep these cars on the road no matter what. So you just can't help but appreciate it. Every day we forget that the cars that were in their millions and were just everywhere, at some point they begin to dwindle, and you don't even notice the fact that it's happening because we're living it every day. You don't see the mixture of the road change. But all of a sudden, they're gone. And you try and find a Ford Sierra now. There were millions of them. You try and find one now, it's almost impossible. You go to a classic car show and you'll see one there, and that's the only time. But, you know, once upon a time, they were the main drivers up and down the motorways. You had all the reps going up and down. They cared so much about the fact that they had the GX model or the GXI. The badge on the back was so important to them in the hierarchy of where they worked. That was the thing. If you had an injection, you were better than this guy. If you had the LX or the GX model, you were like mid-management or even aspiring director level. These sort of things were just what consumed us in the 90s. And those cars, they're still out there, but increasingly they are an endangered species, and that's what makes it, that's what's so great about seeing an everyday 90s car on the road today. Someone has put in the work to keep it going, and it takes real perseverance, but my God, these things, they're just wonderful to see on the road. People sometimes forget the 90s was just an era of extreme optimism and creativity. You know, we had things like Euro 96 right in the centre. We had Britpop. We had this incredible resurgence of cultural moments and phenomenons and personalities. There was a lot more wealth. There was a lot more film. There was a lot more just people were interested generally in music in a way that really had taken off massively, and what you found there was that car culture embraced that. So cars, music, films all sort of started to come together. You started to have a lot more car movies. The cars that were in those movies, therefore, people massively wanted. That's a lot where things like the Max Power generation came from. So that whole tuning, peacocking, showing off things was just a wonderful thing. I mean, I was never into car customization. I didn't do it. I was never one of the Max Power sort of subscribers and people that followed that. But you can't help but fall in love with the dedication of someone who's going to take a Vauxhall Corsa that costs 14 grand and then spend £40,000 modding it and adding a new engine. I mean, you know, I just salute these people. That insanity is something that I can only hope to achieve. Driving in the 90s really was all about freedom. You had more reliable cars, they were more enjoyable to drive. The thing that you notice most of all is that the roads were in a better shape than they are now. That's quite interesting. You did not have the scourge of the driver, which was the speed camera. It was called a Gatso originally, after I think the Swiss gentleman that invented it, but they started to proliferate really at the end of that period, and then obviously they multiplied in their thousands. Yes, you had people would steal and race and drive fast, and then they would get chased by the coppers, and then they get taken down, and that was it. It was a nice, simple transactional process. That's what happened if you're an idiot. You got chased by the police in some lovely, powerful, beautiful car, like a Granada Scorpio or something, and then they would stop you, and that would be it. And everyone else just drove pretty well, actually, but more or less they could focus just on the business of driving. These days, there's too many distractions. There's touch screens, there's signs, there's warnings, there's speed traps. There's just too much going on. And you notice it actually driving on the continent. You can drive for 5, 6, 7 hours in France or Germany and not feel tired at all and enjoy the experience. And as soon as you get back into this country, after an hour you're completely knackered because you just too much. It's sensory overload, and it just feels like a war on drivers. It doesn't feel like you're in a friendly environment. It feels like someone's out to get you. In the 90s, that just wasn't the case. Well, car culture in the 90s, if you're talking about car meets, it was quite different than it is today. Today, of course, you've got WhatsApp groups and you've got people posting stuff on Instagram and messaging, and everyone can get together and coordinate incredibly quickly. You know, if you're talking, you've got groups like Supercar Driver that can pull people together. You've got Tribal Porsche on Instagram that can pull people together, and venues like Caffeine and Machine, and there are many of these sort of things starting based around pulling people together. In the 90s, though, it was quite different. The 90s, it was basically, do you want to go to the McDonald's down the road and do massive donuts in it? So if you had a trading estate or a fast food restaurant, people naturally congregated around there in the cars and peacocking and showing them off. If you were talking about actual coordinated groups, you were basically talking about early stage text messaging. You were talking about people doing things through very rudimentary bulletin boards using dial-up modems, but generally it was word of mouth. It was shouting out at people in a car that you really liked at the lights and saying, do you want to go over there? Do you want to go to Keynsham on Saturday? Keynsham, yeah. Saturday, McDonald's. that was basically how they started. That's all you're having. That's all you're flipping having.
Keep an eye on Influx if you're ready for part 2, where we'll be up in the revs for 90s sports and performance. If you've got a story from driving in the 90s, be sure to tell us all about it. Let us know in the comments.